Welcome to In Confidence, where what we share in confidence helps us grow in confidence. This is the last quarter challenge where each week we introduce a micro moment, something that you can practice for 15 minutes that will ladder up your confidence week to week. I really believe that the work we put in this last quarter sets us up for a 2026 that is filled with success and joy. This week's micro moment is one that I practice multiple times every day. So not only are we asking you to just do it once, but I actually use this tool almost every single day. My friend Jane Park, she introduced it to me a few years ago, and it was inspired by a TV show, and it's changed my life. And it's called Worst Case, Best Case, Most Likely Case. And really, it helps me in almost any situation because I think on a daily basis, we face uncertainty. And when we face uncertainty, our brains default to fear as opposed to cognitive good thinking. And we oftentimes imagine the worst case scenario because our inner critic is with us always. And so our inner critic shows up first. And we start to treat the worst case scenario as fact, as if that's going to be the outcome. And this week, I want us to widen the lens in our brains to look at the whole picture, the worst case, the best case, and the most likely. Because I think perspective on its own is a confidence practice, that when you see more possibilities and you give yourself a chance to consider, here's what my inner critic would say, here's what my superpowers would say in terms of the best case, we create more choices. One of my other best friends, Tekla, often says, from good options come good decisions. And so I love that we can actually create more options for our brain to consider and create more routes to success. So whether it's a job interview, a tough conversation, waiting for news that you can't control, I want your mind not to naturally catastrophize because that's where we naturally jump to. We jump straight to catastrophe. And the truth is that catastrophe, yes, it could happen and you want to be prepared for it. But most of the time, that fear never materializes. And so what we're going to talk through today is how do we reality check our thoughts, rebalance our emotions in a logical and surprisingly calming way. So at like every micro moment, I'm going to first start with the science of what's happening. The second is walk you through how to practice it. And the third is talk a bit about the benefits of this approach. So what is the science behind when we catastrophize? When you imagine a challenging situation, your brain isn't just thinking, it's actually trying to predict the outcome. And what we're trying to do with this exercise is interrupt your brain's predictive threat circuitry, because your brain is going to default to the inner critic and default to protecting you. And that is really the science we're going to explore today. So your brain is oftentimes a prediction machine, and it doesn't like uncertainty. So when we think about the brain as a prediction engine, it's always trying to think about what's next. That's why there's all this work around how do you stay in the present, because your brain defaults to predicting. And when it doesn't have enough information, it fills the gaps with threat by default, because we are fundamentally protecting ourselves. There's a self-protective mechanism. And that is why evolutionarily we prepare for danger. And that trumps the idea that everything is fine and will work out. And when your brain perceives that uncertainty, it sees it as a threat. And worst case thinking comes from the amygdala and the salience network. That is your fear center. Have you ever had a parent tell you, or you remember, maybe you as a parent have said this, count to 10 when something bad happens or when you're scared or nervous? Your amygdala, your fear center shows up first any single time something negative is about to happen. And it takes 10 seconds for your prefrontal cortex, the good part of your brain, to show up to the party. And so the amygdala shows up when there's uncertainty, and it sends out a biological alarm. It actually activates a whole network which prioritizes threat and heightens emotional sensitivity and emotional intensity. And so your attention becomes narrowed to a scarier set of possibilities, even if they're not probable. So this is called catastrophic bias. Now, your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that controls problem solving and constructive thinking, it actually can't regulate fear without being given a task. And so we often think about reframing as about being positive, but it's not just that. It's about giving your prefrontal cortex something concrete to do so it can regain control and it can create options separate from the emotional fear centers. So when you actually introduce an exercise into the equation, your prefrontal cortex has something to do, something to navigate. And the exercise we're going to be doing a little bit later, worst case, best case, most likely, it gives the prefrontal cortex structure, steps. It allows it to fight any predictive behavior that defaults to threat, and it overrides fear. And so I often say in a lot of my speeches, this exercise allows you to give the inner critic a voice. So it allows you to realize it's harsh, pessimistic, backwards looking, and you have the opportunity to drown it out with the megaphone of your superpowers. It allows you to bring your strengths into the equation to fight that fear factor. Here's why listening and listing the worst case actually helps. When we avoid worst case scenario thinking, we actually strengthen the fear circuitry. And when you confront it, it weakens it. There's a lot of science behind the fact that when you can name and label your fear and your outcomes, it reduces the physiological charge that you feel and the emotions you feel when your amygdala is involved. So I often tell people that when you can say the worst case scenario out loud or on paper, it loses its power. You realize that your inner critic, by the way, is very backwards looking, very pessimistic, and your amygdala actually starts to quiet down because you've named and labeled out loud or on paper what the worst case is. And this is why some people often feel immediate relief. You know, one of the things that I always say is when you're holding on to something that you're anxious about, just saying it to a friend or saying it out loud to yourself or writing it down, all of a sudden you don't hold that fear inside you. I will often call my best friend Jane and just be like, can I just say all the things out loud to you? I just need to say all the worst case scenarios out loud to you. And then we can start talking about best case and most likely. What the best case scenario does, it activates a part of your brain that broadens its cognitive function. And in fact, it increases the amount of positive emotions you feel and widens your sense of what's possible. The positive effect also increases dopamine and aids creativity and problem solving. So when you start to move away from the worst case and you start thinking about the best case, what ends up happening is your brain regains access to its lateral thinking, threat rigidity decreases, and you become more resourceful. It actually activates motivation and suppresses the feelings that fear creates in your body. The most likely case is the real regulator. So this step and why we introduce it in the exercise, it's the powerhouse because it then introduces probability. And probabilistic reasoning activates all these parts of your brain: logic, risk evaluation, memory integration. And when we actually start to think about probabilities, anxiety decreases and we don't fear risk as much. Structured reasoning actually restores your ability to go through life. So once you identify the most likely case, what's actually happening is uncertainty declines, stress hormones drop, and your confidence increases. The most likely case is actually the step that literally resets your threat circuitry. I'm also going to say, as part of the exercise, how you do the exercise matters. I'm going to put out a piece. I usually do it verbally to a friend because I love having a shame buddy. It increases connection. And for me, I'm a verbal person, like saying it out loud, working through it is often how I process things. But I default to superpowers like performing, which are more extroverted. If you have a more introverted style, I would say that maybe verbal techniques aren't going to work best for you. Maybe writing it is actually the best way to do that. And there's a whole body of research from neuroscientists that say writing may be the best way to improve emotional regulation. If you write the worst case, best case, and most likely case down, you have the opportunity to process it emotionally, engage your language centers, and reduce limbic activity. It'll also increase the coherence between brain networks, and you may physiologically feel calmer. Doing this exercise will help you reframe uncertainty for the long term. And this is a core link to confidence. Psychological flexibility, the ability to shift perspective, reappraise threats, take action under uncertainty, is strongly linked to lower anxiety, better decision-making, long-term resilience, and it persists across situations. So I'm going to argue that this exercise fundamentally puts you on a path to having more psychological flexibility. All right. All of this adds up to this particular micro moment, why I do it multiple times per day. It actually re-engages your brain in a totally different direction, especially when you face uncertainty. And I think it reframes perspective and gives you a sense of options. So how are we going to do it? I'm going to give you an example that I face almost every single day. As an entrepreneur, we're never quite sure what resources we're going to have available, which ones we have to deploy, and all of that. And whenever I have to go through and think through a game plan where I'm not sure what the outcome will be, I will start with, okay, what's the worst case in this scenario? Like, for example, negotiating a big opportunity. I'll say, we don't get it, or we never hear back from them, or they go with someone else, right? So I will often articulate out loud, what's the worst case that could happen? And then I'll say, what's the best case? They want us very badly. They want the deal to happen. We're going to get it done very, very quickly. It's going to be amazing. And then I will say, here's the most likely. It's going to probably be somewhere in between. I'm probably going to have a response from them. It's not exactly what we wanted. We're going to have to renegotiate a little bit. I think ultimately we'll end up doing this work together, but it won't be exactly how I pictured it. And in the process, we'll get to know this particular new partner better. I do this in my personal life where I will think through worst case, best case, and most likely on a very regular basis in terms of personal decisions I have to make, commitments I want to take on. I often think about even just getting my puppy. What's the worst that's going to happen? And the best has actually materialized more often. If you get a chance, I want you to Google on YouTube or whatnot, the TV show This Is Us. If some of you may or may not have seen it, but Beth and Randall Pearson are my favorite couple. And if you just put in worst case scenario into YouTube, This Is Us, Beth and Randall Pearson, this was an exercise they did on the show as part of the storyline. And whenever they had to make a big decision, like there's this decision where they're going to decide to move to Philadelphia, and they asked their 3 kids, what's the worst case that could happen? And the kids go around and they talk about, well, my friends in my hometown where we've grown up will forget me and I won't make any new friends, or we'll never see dad because of, and they actually go around and they give voice to their inner critic. I've named my inner critic, by the way. My inner critic's name is Fred. I love naming it because it kind of deflates the inner critic's power. But they go and talk about all the worst case things that could happen by moving to Philadelphia. And then you'll see something turn. They'll talk about how strong they are as a family. They'll talk about the best case scenario. And you realize that most likely is closer to best because you're now in control. And so this exercise ultimately is all about, in uncertainty, we certainly don't know the outcomes, but we can control how we handle our emotions and our process in doing so. This week, I want to hear from you. I want to hear how you've practiced worst case, best case, and most likely. It's my favorite tool to teach. It's my favorite tool to do on an ongoing basis. And I'm going to post this episode on my LinkedIn. So I hope that you'll comment how you've taken on the challenge and enter our last quarter challenge weekly giveaway and our mega giveaway. If you love this episode, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. It might be your shame buddy that you're like, can we just do this exercise together because I need someone to talk it out with? Or maybe you've written it down and you want to reflect on it. Subscribe so you never miss a moment of inspiration. And until next time, in the words of my 9-year-old self, I see you, I value you, and I believe in you. This is In Confidence.